Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. I'm going to start doing more of these videos, little explainers, little points of view. So thanks for joining me. I'll post them on X and I'll post them on my YouTube channel, which I'm trying to grow. So please do try to join me on YouTube as we try to get the numbers moving there. Today I want to talk about NATO. And we hear a lot now in the media and the client media in the West, which of course is funded centrally by Western governments, Western NGOs very heavily. We saw USAID's big reveal that 90% of Ukrainian media was funded directly by USAID. Still, a lot of Western media is to a great extent funded and influenced by Western NGOs, which are often covers for Western intelligence. Take Chatham House, for example, a very famous British think tank. They're funded by the Henry Ford Foundation, by Bill and Melinda Gates, by lots of old money type of institutions, by the European Union, and by individual countries like the British government, the Canadian government, a lot of NATO members. So remember, when you see these independent media outlets doing their independent work, who's probably behind them pulling the strings. But let's talk about NATO. NATO was established, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in the aftermath of the Second World War, essentially to stop the proliferation of communism in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, the two biggest elements of the NATO Charter that you are going to hear about are Article 5 and probably to some extent Article 6, which defines the geographical area in which NATO has to operate. And that is interesting too, because it restricts NATO to Europe, Northern Europe, and of course some islands under the control of the United States as well. It's quite distinct. The second one, of course, is Article 5. Article 5 is collective defence, or what's perceived as collective defence. And this is where it gets really interesting, and this is what I want to talk to you guys about. Article 5 suggests in the media that any NATO member that's attacked, it's considered to be an attack on every other NATO member. Now, what's interesting, if you actually read the specifics of Article 5, is that each country is then allowed and completely legally unobliged to go to war with an aggressor which attacks one element. So there's no obligation whatsoever for a NATO member to commit into military action should another NATO member get attacked. It just doesn't exist. The perception is, and the idea behind it, is collective defense. So that could mean sending medical equipment, it could mean sending fuel, it could mean anything. It doesn't have to mean military aid. So this is a crucial element of the reality of what NATO is and what the Article 5 collective defense, one in all in, means. For example, take Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, three very small and essentially military insignificant countries. If, for example, Russia came into conflict with Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania around the Kaliningrad region in the Baltic Sea, an air incident which was declared aggression by Russia. Let's just, imagine that's the case. Do you expect or think it's even remotely plausible to suggest that Turkey would then begin to assault Russian forces or the Navy on the Black Sea, or that Sweden and Finland would then encroach across the border to attack Russia or to start shooting down Russian air assets? I don't think that's going to happen. And I think the membership of NATO know that's not going to happen. And again, the actual treaty itself, Article 5, which we hear, proffered constantly, nobody can attack NATO because everybody would immediately be at war. That's not the case. Article 5 is very clear. It means every country has a right to provide whatever assistance they deem necessary. That could be no assistance. So that's really the point of my little video today, is to highlight that. I'm going to throw up a graphic of the actual text of Article 5. And Article 6, of course, which suggests the geographical area of operation of NATO. Now, the other thing that's interesting about NATO, of course, is the fact that when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, or was destroyed, depending on which way you want to look at it, the Warsaw Pact, which was essentially the Soviet version of NATO, which kind of became the CSTO in the aftermath of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact itself was disbanded very quickly, and this feeds into the reality about what actually happened in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation's foreign policy posture towards the West, which was very open and seeking to actually grow connections, geostrategic and economic, with the West. Of course, we know that that hand which was outstretched was essentially slapped away. But the Warsaw Pact itself, it completely disappeared. It was disbanded. Meanwhile, NATO, which raison d'etre was to exist to counter the proliferation of Soviet communist doctrine towards west of Europe, it didn't disappear. It didn't disappear. The threat that caused it to exist disappeared. Communism disappeared out from Europe essentially, completely. The Warsaw Pact disappeared completely. But NATO, which was established to counter a threat which had disappeared overnight, didn't disappear. And I would like to ask you, why do you think that is the case? Shouldn't it have disappeared? I think it should have disappeared. But it didn't disappear. It did the opposite. It got much, much bigger. NATO grew, particularly post collapse of the Soviet Union, taking in countries which were in Russia's and Soviet Union's natural sphere of influence. So you could talk about independence and very other, realities around small states on the borders of huge states. Go back and look at the Monroe Doctrine, which is, a very old document, Monroe, the U.S. president, which suggested that anybody in the American geographic sphere of influence was essentially subject to American will, military and economic. So this isn't a Russian idea. It's probably an American one. We can talk about Monroe Doctrine again. But in this context, NATO didn't disappear. NATO grew and it expanded, many would say, including myself, quite aggressively towards the borders with Russia. Now, people say, the Russians were the main constituent of the Soviet Union. That's when it suits them. When it suits them to say, it was the people of the 15 republics or the 14 other republics other than Russia that defeated the Nazis. But when it comes to communism and imperialism, Russia was the main protagonist. So it doesn't make sense. So, two little takeaways from this short video. Article 5, this collective defense obligation. There is no obligation on any NATO member to commit to military action against anybody who is perceived as attacking another member. Zero legal or even sort of imagined obligation. The obligation may be, even if you could argue that, to provide assistance, but it's assistance as deemed necessary by the sovereign state member. Think about that, which could be helmets, medicine, fuel, some money, or it could be nothing at all. Remember, NATO is an organization made up of a very disparate group of people, economically, socially, and politically. Hungary is a NATO member, remember, which is very much at odds now with the political wing of NATO, the European Union. Turkey is a NATO member, which has been at odds with Finland and Sweden over various issues, political, religious. So this is a very uneasy family, and the idea that they're all going to immediately pile into a war with Russia if Russia decided to or was blamed on engaging a single NATO country is a myth and a fantasy. And it's worth bearing that in mind when you consider the real politic of what's happening in Europe right now, particularly around Ukraine. So, until next time, thanks for watching this little experimental kind of video. And please do subscribe and do follow and do like what I'm trying to do. Much appreciated. Talk to you soon.